asterisk at the start. So turns out, a little miscommunication between the boss man and myself. We had talked about, I'm going to teach this class for the next couple of weeks so I can get more experience in the big room, which is just really intimidating, but don't smile at that. So that's helpful. And we talked about, where the class was going, and we were talking about, okay, let's do some proofs for the existence of God. But then he was telling me about the sort of main topic that he was going to do, a couple weeks ago when he was sick. And I said, actually, that sounds pretty good. And I talked with Carrie, and that's what was printed in the bulletin. But then Father John didn't look in the bulletin, so that's why, for those of you that were at 8:30, this is not Aquinas' Proofs for the Existence of God. We'll do that next week. I love some good, proofs, who doesn't love some good logic? But we do have some interesting stuff to talk about today, and which sort of begins with this observation about the uniqueness of man, of human beings, and asking several questions about what is it that separates human beings from animals. And thumb? Oh, our thumb. Well, some, but maybe the monkey's close. That's one of the questions. And there's been a narrative for I don't know, depending on what part of history you look at, for at least 100 years or 200 or 300 years, science being sort of the more welcome explanation for what all this means. And so particularly the theory of evolution, but I've gone slightly ahead of myself. So we're asking the question, what makes man, what makes us different, right? And so we all of us in this room, are coming at this from a different perspective from the rest of the world, or the secular world, if you will. I think it's probably safe to assume that most of us, have some sort of common belief in God. We believe that, He created the world, and we know that, we are created in the image of God, and all these things are good and true, and we can accept that as true. But there's a question for us to consider is, what does that mean when someone disagrees and doesn't believe that God or some other being created the world? What does it mean if someone thinks that we, developed over billions of years, from some primordial goop or whatever, and that we're actually just one step removed from a monkey? That sounds, I know, and even the baby's confused by it too, right? That, what does that mean? And for us, we have this common belief, and one of the things we all talk about for a couple of months now, is how we have, this text in the Bible that gives us a story and a narrative that explains, what God's, intention for the world is, and we can accept that as true. But for someone that has no interest or doesn't believe in the Bible, that's not a proof text for them, right? So we can't use that as explaining oh yeah, there's a guy that created everything. Someone on the outside has already dismissed that, right? So I was reading, a lot of the content from this comes from a book by G.K. Chesterton called The Everlasting Man, and he wrote this back in 1925, and he was responding to some other British guy that had put together a long 24-volume series of his history of creation, particularly of man, and tracing what that actually looked like. But his conclusion is very different than our own. He's trying to claim that man over and over is just kind of bland and doesn't have much purpose, and that it's just a failed attempt after failed attempt for human beings to try to come together as a community, but not really, and that they're just trying to be happy, but there's not much purpose other than that, and it's very short-sighted in our mind, but it kind of misses the point. And so Chesterton writes, and he's refuting a lot of this, and there's some interesting narrative that I want to describe. So I don't know about you, but one of the things I've heard for not my entire life, but a significant portion, from a number of people that maybe had grown up in the church or had some affiliation. They had heard some part of the Bible. They knew a little bit of it. And then at some point in their life, they got totally disenfranchised and said that they didn't care, didn't believe, or any number of in their mind, they came up with all these logical reasons why all the church stuff, all the Bible stuff is totally junk and not shouldn't be cared about at all. And so there's this interesting thing that happens where a lot of the most outspoken critics of Christianity are themselves are kind of too close to it and have some idea of it, but it's kind of loosely formed and not fully fleshed out. So they have these ideas of what Christianity is and what it believes, and then they like to complain about it. Does that sound at all familiar to you? Do you have anyone come to mind, where you know someone that they kind of know a little bit, but then they just like to bash on it and complain about it and critique it to wit's end? And I find that personally very frustrating, but that's okay. That is what it is. But what's odd about that, though, one of their critiques is they're putting the entire burden of proof upon Christianity, and nothing kind of goes back at them. That they're quick to dismiss their need to take ownership. So one of the critiques is that, take for example, wars. So this was written just after World War I, and one of the common critiques of these people that were kind of affiliated but had become disaffiliated were wanting to blame the church for not having prevented it. Which, obviously we want the church to be a good example and witness to the world and to be promoting peace and charity and all these things, but I would want to turn the person's perspective back on themselves and ask well, can't you do some of that too? It seems kind of odd that only when it's convenient to them do they want to blame the church and then remove their own ownership for part of the problem. And one of the observations is that the church has this, it becomes, understandably so, gets a big target on its back, so to speak. So these are some, I find them kind of whimsical, but interesting observations that Chesterton has. This is just, again, he's talking about this 100 years ago, of people complaining about parsons, priests dressed up as parsons, but they don't have any problem with, a policeman or a postal worker or something else. He's asking the question, why does the church get this, criticism? I'm not sure, but that's what happens, and this is happening then, and I believe it still happens today. I thought it was an interesting understanding of the pulpit. A pulpit being, quote unquote, a coward's castle, but we don't call the editor's office of a journal or the newspaper the coward's castle as well. Although he thinks the journalists could probably deserve some more criticism themselves, whatever. But this quote I find particularly insightful. They will suddenly turn around and revile the church for not having prevented the war, which they themselves did not want to prevent, and which nobody had ever professed to be able to prevent. So it's this sort of weird, after the fact, wanting to put blame on this, entity. Does that make sense? And that just seems, if you look at it, purely objectively, or as objectively as you can, taking a few steps back, why does the blame have to go on the church? Why does it have to go on that? Why not any other group of human beings? Now, we know that, we have, that's something that we're called to do, that we have sort of standards of living, that's something that we sort of accept, and so we'll take that burden on, if you will, and that's okay. But one of the things that is happening is they're wanting to downplay all the things that we sort of claim to be true, primarily that we are created in the image of God. And this is where we're getting to something really fun, is that they try to make this jump from, the monkey down to us and saying, and I don't know how exactly this developed, but I certainly have heard of it, and this was happening back then as well, that for some reason, they want to downplay the uniqueness and the importance and the potential of human life, of human potential to create. So like one of the things that we all know about human beings is that we like actually create for fun, whether it be like music or art. And that should tip your hat a little bit to think, oh, that is something that is unique to human beings. That's not what a monkey or a dog can do. And that's kind of where we're headed to next. So one of the questions asked is, what is different about human beings now and human beings like 10,000 years ago? So we have like different clothes, probably different speech patterns, and that's fine. But what I want to argue is that there's not really anything that is fundamentally different about human beings 10,000 years ago and human beings now. Obviously, we have different levels of knowledge, but there's not like, you can't really point to something specific and say like, a human being 10,000 years ago is less of a human being than one today. And one of the things Chesterton is trying to claim and refute this narrative that human beings as a whole are nothing more than like one step removed from being like a Neanderthal with in a cave and like a gorilla, that like they're basically the same. And that just seems kind of preposterous, but that's like one of the narratives that I'm sure you've heard in some way, maybe dressed up a little bit differently. So again, asking what's different between us and the past. So I want to look at creation, and we'll kind of go through this thought exercise about depending on your perspective, creation is either a really exciting moment. For us, we believe that God like spoke into existence creation. But for those on another side of the spectrum, view it as like nothing other than just like any old day where like something kind of appeared out of a star, and then out of that came planets and like strange animals, and out of that came humankind. So from one perspective, Earth, what we know as Earth, from our perspective, is significant. But from the science, or from like the theory of evolution, it might as well be any other like rock. And to me, that I don't like, but that's just me. So modern histories of mankind sort of start with this accepted premise that evolution is like totally true. And personally, that's like fine to say. We're not, seven-day creationists or whatever. I mean, if you want to, I guess so, but we're not flat earthers. Like, we have progressed, but the concept of time, like, that doesn't really matter. That's one of my points for today. But we put forth this idea, I don't say we, but there's been this idea of evolution that, over time, over like 600 million years or several billion years, whatever the case may be, that some significant amount of change has happened. And for one reason or another, the idea that it's a very slow, gradual change, that seems to be more palatable or more acceptable. Like people just like, oh, that sounds great. Of course, we can evolve over that course of time. That's their claim. And that, I think, is kind of it's slightly more peculiar than to say that in the beginning an unthinkable power began an unthinkable process. But in a way, that's what we're saying with creation, that some being created everything out of nothing. But if the process is slow and gradual, then people are happy to accept it. But really, there's not something like tangibly different of what we're trying to claim. But if you don't believe in miracles, or if you do believe in miracles, it doesn't matter if the miracle itself is slow or fast. Like if cancer gets healed in a day, or if it gets healed in a year, they're both a miracle, right? Mm-hmm. Like nothing tangibly different if both the healing, the miracle itself happened. You know, if like a wizard's flying through the air from the top of a tower like very dramatically, or if it's an old like man kind of like walking clumsily like through the air somehow, like both those are still like magical, but one might seem to be like, is it any different? I'm going to argue, no, it's not any different. But science has been making claims that a caveman living in some crude cave had a barbaric way of life, so to speak, or uncivilized. I'm sure you've heard this claim as well. But the question is that a substantiated claim? Is that a reasonable claim, or is it just conjecture? So let's look at that for a second. Okay, I forgot we're going to talk about the monkey. So I don't know if you've heard about Lucy, who's supposedly like the first human. I don't really know. I didn't look that extensively into it, but supposedly like this is who they came up with as the first human. I'm not sure, 3.2 million years ago. She's 3'6". And so one of the claims that they're trying to make is that a gradual change, that to go from this to like a human being that we recognize now, if it's over the course of 3 million years, like that's perfectly acceptable. To me, I'm not going to personally quite buy that, because there is fundamentally something different between a monkey or some primate and a human being. And that's where we're going to next. So, there's this image of a caveman that I don't know if you've heard about. You know, in the Paleolithic era, if you will, there's this idea of like this man in like a loincloth with like a big club, and he just takes the woman, like puts, you know, over his shoulders and like carries her off. And I don't know why like that's become a narrative when we don't really have any actual demonstrable proof or evidence to prove that that's actually how the caveman actually lived. Like we have nothing to substantiate that as far as I know. We have like evidence of like some tools and stuff, but we have no way of knowing that they lived like significantly different than us. Obviously they were trying to survive, and so they were, you know, we get that term hunter-gatherer, but the idea that they're living vastly different than us, you know, being in a community, I don't know if we can make that claim. And we could say it's probably different. They communicated differently, sure. They wore different clothes or no clothes or whatever, that's fine. But as human beings, did they function substantially different than us? I would argue no. So one of the questions for science, though, is this the most likely conclusion? Now, we don't have any way to substantially say, well, here is the likely conclusion for exactly like, you know, how they live, but to make this claim seems very odd, that it's trying to downplay and assume that they are like barbaric or crude or like cruel. Like that doesn't make sense either. But that seems to be an acceptable conclusion for this narrative that human beings 10,000 years ago were vastly different than us. But part of their claim is that human beings themselves are not special and don't have any like what we would call any likeness to God. But they want to completely remove that connection. So what we do know about cavemen, I don't know if you've heard about some of these caves in France. Has anyone seen any picture that kind of looks like this? I've got another one. So there's several of them, and I just picked two little pictures, but there's like some really, really impressive and beautiful artwork or cave art that like is actually really impressive. And one of the things that we can conclude from something like this, or this, is that these people were able to observe, and then they wanted to like create something. That they took time to like look very intently at how like the form of these animals were, and they were able to reproduce that. And they created like what we would call art. For them, you know, they were drawing something. I don't know if they like called it art or whatever, that's not the point. But the point is that they created this. And that is fundamentally something absolutely uniquely human. that no other being does, like at all. So again, it seems odd that cavemen are like depicted, as being like barbaric with a club and like, I don't know, insert whatever. I don't know, I didn't really watch the Flintstones, so I can't really make a connection to that. But the idea that they're just like Neanderthals that were necessarily like cruel or mean or something like that and didn't have any sense to create, this is what we do have. This is the evidence that tips us off to something of a unique quality of human beings that we all share. And so this is what we did find. And again, this is in like some remote cavern that's not like readily accessible or like an obvious place to go. And so you could ask a question like, well, what else could this cave mean? Could this cave be like some secret like gathering place? Could it be a place for some sort of religious worship? Could it be like, any number of things? Like we don't know. It could be, but those would be pure conjecture to assume based off of like what we think they kind of acted like, and we just don't know. So it's not, in my mind, it's not prudent to assume like that this does or doesn't mean like that they had like art classes on like Mondays or something. That would be kind of foolish, but it could be. My French is terrible, so I'm not even going to bother to pronounce it, but this was dated, I think, 30,000 BC, which is kind of remarkable. They also found like what appears to be some type of like earring and necklace too. So we have some remarkable insight that they had some concept of like beauty in, again, creating and using like creative skill to create, which is like the fourth time I've said that. So, sorry. So we hear that cavemen are ancestors, but we hear that they're barbaric and don't have the same conscience that we do. We would never be barbaric. We would never be hurting people like. No, never. So like, that's also odd to assume that like they're much worse or significantly different than us too. Like again, that claim doesn't hold up. Now, if we look at this, let's say from the eyes of a child for just a moment. The common sense of a child would think, someone drew a picture of a cow or a deer or a horse. Like, all they're going to see is, someone drew some art. And then if you're anything like my child, they're like, I want to draw it too. Like, that's a normal thing, and that is a reasonable conclusion to make. And that's coming just from the eyes of a child, which I think that is something special too. That speaks, I think, to the universal nature of this, that this is something that we can all appreciate and intuit. And that, like when my son asks to color, there's nothing more on his mind than he just wants to color and create something. He doesn't have some other maybe he has a motive to get on my good side or whatever, but there's not much more than he wants to create simply from the joy of creating something. And that, I think, that seems like a potentially reasonable conclusion to make about what the cavemen might have done too. The pictures themselves, they don't prove that the cavemen lived in caves. We don't know that. They could have lived anywhere, but we know that they hung out and did some stuff, and that's fine. But again, if you find let's say a wine cellar in some 19th century Victorian house, would that prove that all Victorian era middle-aged classes lived underground? No, that just meant they had a wine cellar, so to see one instance, you got to be careful about what you present or offer as the causation, not the causation, but the demonstrable proof for what that means, if that makes sense. But our conclusion for this simply is that man is special, that man is unique, and that man is different than animal. And again, a child can understand this. And now, to put just another spin on it for just a moment, My claim is that any child will look at this and recognize that as art, and then recognize it as something like, oh, they can create art too. And even the most like progressive-minded, free-thinking, like, out there child or person, they aren't going to look at that and think, oh, they're not going to expect to find a picture of a man and assume that like a deer painted it. Like that would be silly, we think, but that would be like odd because that has nowhere been found. That you could go like into the farthest, like deepest, darkest, like unknown portions of the world, and you wouldn't see that type of thing, some form of art, some form, some symbol, some expression of something, of some shape. You're not going to find that being produced by an animal. Like that doesn't happen. Now, like, there's that idea of like a monkey could like maybe learn to paint something or like maybe type on a typewriter, but like it's like a 1 in 15 billion chance that they would write the word banana. Like that, I think also says something, right? So I think it's absurd, again, to claim that we are just one step removed from the monkey. We know that, animals can be independent. They can like forage, they can find food for themselves. They're trying to survive. Like a cow can find a new pasture, but a cow isn't going to build like a cattle shed or like a new shelter for himself. He'll like hide under a tree. That's normal. We make homes to live in, so do birds. But what do birds not do? They don't do anything else with the nest. They have the nest, they lay eggs there. Okay, art is the signature of man. This was the quote that I was trying to think of. Nowhere will we find one finger that had traced one significant line upon the sand. Nowhere one claw that had even begun to scratch the faint suggestion of a form. But human beings do that all the time. Little kids do that as young as like 2, where they're trying to like create something. Like that should tell us something. Okay, so man's capabilities, one of those is to express like symbols. So a bird, if a bird didn't make a nest, we could maybe claim that the bird is some great philosopher or something else, that makes it, distinct from other birds. But what we've observed over, thousands and thousands of years is that they don't really do anything else with it. They get the same little twigs and like form a nest, but that's it. They're not creating. Obviously they sing, as songbirds do, but they're not creating anything else simply for the joy of just creating. Like that doesn't happen. We see in human beings, we have the gift of expression or symbolism. When we dream or have any other action that represents an idea, that's a way of expressing this gift. When we laugh, we're responding to all these like sort of cultural connections and expectations that like make us laugh because we find humor in something and that's based off of all this prior understanding. But that same type of built up of community and identity doesn't happen out in the wild. I mean, there can be herds of like a community of animals, but they don't have the same identity that human beings express themselves with either. Human beings create. We form cultures and rites, like not just like religious rites, although we do that, but think of like a birthday party and all the things that go with that, and all these ways of honoring people's lives. Like that is also uniquely human. Okay, well, man, this goes by very fast and it's very fun. So, Christianity is itself unique too. There's all these ideas in like pagan worship that are so remarkably distinct and foreign and alien to something that we all fundamentally understand about Christianity. That Christianity is the only thing that really offers hope. And it's the only religion that has like a good God that came in our flesh too. If you think about, like Greek and Roman mythology that have like all sorts of different gods, but they're all like terrible people. Like that's fundamentally very different. And the interaction between man and those gods is also completely different than our own, where they're just trying to like appease in weird ways, but they also recognize that like Zeus is like a freewheeling guy and he's going to do whatever Zeus wants to do, and that doesn't make sense either because he's an immoral person. We have hope that we have are part of this mission to save the world, and that's completely distinct from other religions. And also, we have truth in it. One of the things that human beings desire, I might be getting ahead of myself, that's okay. One of the things that human beings fundamentally desire is some type of romance or narrative. And they also desire truth. And that is something that God offers and not anything else. And this is pulling it all the way back to the beginning when we were noting how the church kind of gets bashed on for like not stopping a world war or something like that. But when the world goes wrong, it proves rather that the church is right. This is a fundamental claim of Christianity, that like we recognize that we have all this opportunity to create and do good, but we also recognize and admit and like recognize up front that we need help, and we're also going to like work at doing that too. The church is justified not because her children do not sin, but because they do. That it's this like almost chicken before the egg type of situation where because we do fail, we do recognize that we need the help too. And I really like this particular quote of this is recognizing the people that are criticizing the faith as well, that they their perspective is blurred by being too close to like the Christian worldview, but not close enough to really understand everything. There's like, they say there's two ways to get home. You either don't leave your home or you go all the way around to get back to it. You think about that for a second? It's kind of funny. This reveals something, I think, distinct for people that are living on the sort of outskirts and have, walked away from the faith or belief in God, whether it be, distinctly Christian or Anglican, any belief in God. Now they had this shadow, they're living in the shadow and influence, but have lost the light that is offered by a fuller faith, if that makes sense. I think is a clever way to put it. And that's all we have for today, because it's time. So I want to say thank you all for coming. Next week we will do Quantities of Proof for the Existence of God, because they're very fun. And that's what I went to seminary for. That's the good stuff. So again, thank you all very much, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you all.
Thank you.